Decided I'd sit down today, and you guys can be comfortable. I can too. So the only thing is, you can't go to sleep because I can't either. So stay awake. It's been an interesting week. Really enjoyed Tuesday, seeing all these people coming through the building here, and it was just exciting to see this happen. And then Wednesday was not quite as exciting, as well as Thursday, and then Saturday, and the problems that we've gone through there. But in the midst of it all, I was able to get things going. This morning we're going to be dealing with Ruth, if you haven't seen that. The title of my message is Foreigner, Faith, and Female. These three things all fall into place here with this story of Ruth. I don't know how much you've looked around out in the lobby, but there's some pictures out there that we've got hung that are from Precious Moments Chapel up in Missouri, outside of Carthage, Missouri. There's a chapel there that Precious Moments built a number of years ago. And on one wall inside the chapel, they had 7 portraits of scenes of the New Testament. On the other side, 7 Old Testament portraits of themes, things that took place in the Old Testament. And my son called me and said, "Dad, you can get these 7 New Testament things here, and they're only I think he said $400, $450 maybe, and you could have all 7 of them, and they're just really great. They're artist proofs, and they're going to be worth a lot of money." And I told him, I said, "Troy, I've got you in college, and I just don't have the money right now. We're going to pass on that." Well, the next year he called. He said, "Dad, those $450 deals are now worth $2,000. By the way, they have all the Old Testament pictures now. There's 7 of them that you can get for $550. And so I bought them. I have no idea what they're valued at this point, but I don't really care. I think there's 3 of them hanging out there. There's 2 more in my office. But one of them that's hanging out there is dealing with this story of Ruth. Naomi, in the picture here, you see Naomi and Ruth, and then I keep wanting to say Oprah, and it's not Oprah. It's Orpah. Kind of get my lips around all of that. Orpah's the one you can see in the background there barely as she's walking away. If you want to see that picture, it's out there just above the water fountain, and you can read about under it. The original pictures that they did were at least 15 feet tall, and we just really enjoy looking at these. There's some really good stuff there that has recounted things back in the scriptures that we really liked. But I want to deal with this whole concept of what took place here with Ruth. Ruth is the main character. And so it's in 2 parts that we're going to be dealing here. If you want to turn on the back of your program, you'll see the outline there, and you'll see some places where you can fill in. The red words will be the words to fill in. I think you've got 2 fill-ins today. It's really tough. But it kind of helps to keep you in what's going on here. Part 1 here is Naomi and Ruth in Moab. Let me give you some background of all this. Naomi was married to Elimelech. And being married to him, they lived in Bethlehem, which that's where his family resided, in the Bethlehem area. And things weren't going really well because of the drought or the problems that were coming along physically, for the land there. And so this kind of disaster caused them to decide that they were going to go to where they could grow things and where they could make money and where they could, make a living. They just couldn't do it at home. And so the famine that was there in Judah drove them all the way over to Moab. And it's important for us, I think, to be able to see, well, let me tell you about this too. Elimelech's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, married Moabite women while they were there. Orpah and Ruth. Now, I don't know about you, but take a look at all those names. except for Naomi and Ruth. The rest of them are just, can you imagine taking a little baby and naming it Orpah? Or a little baby in Elimelech. Boy, he looks like an Elimelech to me. This is my son Elimelech. It was amazing to me how some of these names came about, but they were very acceptable names at that time. And so they have moved from the Bethlehem area over to the area of Moab so that they could get away from this famine that was going on. Now, Elimelech and his sons, after they had been there for about 10 years, they died. And kind of interesting that all three of those guys died. And it left these three women as widows. Now, a widow in that day and time was not a good place to be. Women were not necessarily wanting to outlive their husbands because then there was a problem with how do I put food on the table? And jobs weren't available. It was tough to make ends meet. It was tough to keep food there. It was tough to keep a roof over their heads. And so as Naomi and Ruth and Orpah were there in Moab, it was a tough thing for them to be able to stay alive. And so it came down to a point that Naomi decides, I'm going to go back home. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem in that area. Here's a map for you. It's a little hard to read. I'll make it bigger next time. The left red dot is where Bethlehem is. Right above that, the yellow is Jerusalem. The right red one is Moab. So what they do is they'd come up here and they'd go north of the Dead Sea, cross the Jordan River, and come on down into Moab. And Moab was not going through the famine there that Jerusalem or that Bethlehem was. And so they were able to survive there. But by the 10-year period, things had changed, and it was more difficult even in Moab than it was for them back in Bethlehem. And so this is part of the reason why Naomi decides she's going to go back. And she wanted then to deal with these daughters-in-law. Oops, wrong button. Okay, there we go. Nope. Yeah, that's it. So Naomi returns to Bethlehem, but urges her daughters-in-law to stay in their own country of Moab. Okay? That's the way it was. I can just see her. She gets them together, and she sits down maybe at a table, and she says, hey, girls, why? It's just too much for me to stay here. I need to go back home to my family. But you need to stay here with your families and see what will happen. And they said, oh, no, Naomi, we want to stay with you. And then we said, the chances of me finding another husband and getting married again and then having a couple more boys and the amount of time that would be involved in those boys growing up, you guys could marry them and it's just not going to work. You don't want to do that. Why don't you just go back and be with your families? And before it was all said and done, then Orpah decided that's what she was going to do. But Ruth, as it says here, the foreigner will not stay in Moab. Ruth 1:16, I think on your outline it says 1:6, and it should be 1:16, says this. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and this is the biggie, your God will be my God. Now, by doing this, Ruth is really setting things up to be the person that God needed her to be. Let me go back and just share something with you here. There's some interesting footnotes, ideas, and things that come from all of this. This is during the time of the judges that this is taking place. The primary area is Bethlehem, which is very interesting because Bethlehem, again, remember who was born there. That's where Jesus was born. Why was he born there? Because it was the town of his lineage. His parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and all go back into that Bethlehem area. That's where they have land. That's where they possess things. And that's where King David was born. That was his town. And so it was very important that this whole concept of being in Bethlehem. The third thing that really is kind of interesting to me in oversight of all this is, once again, God uses famine. Is that interesting? God didn't use a good thing. He didn't lure them over there by, giving them good things. He lured them over there. He got them by preaching them over there because there was famine in the area where they stayed. Now, when they get back into Bethlehem, and all the family and everybody there sees Naomi, and they know Naomi. They probably don't know Ruth at that point. But they see Naomi, and oh, no, Naomi, thanks for coming back. It's good to see you, man. It's been years since we've seen you, and it's so good. And she says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because that means bitter. And that's the way things have gone for me. My husband died. My 2 boys died. And we were left in a foreign land with no way to stay alive. And so she wanted to be known as a bitter woman. But it was so interesting because it didn't just end there. This is part 1. This is really dealing with how Naomi and Ruth really came to be family together. Part 2 is called Ruth and Boaz at Bethlehem. Now, I kind of like Boaz, so that's kind of a neat name. It's one, I don't know that I've ever known a guy around named Boaz, but it's kind of easy to see and easy to say. And so Boaz was a family member of Abimelech, or Elimelech. That was all part of the family. And Boaz had fields, and he had wheat or whatever growing in it. And so when it came harvest time, and Naomi and Ruth were there, Naomi, being older, sent Ruth out. And this is the neat thing about Ruth. Ruth, I think, part of the reason for sticking with Naomi, not only did she love her as a mother-in-law, which is that pretty neat? How many of you ladies loved your mother-in-law? There's a few of you. That's good. How many of you guys loved your mother-in-law? Oh, not as many hands. But here was a lady who loved her mother-in-law. And so was so concerned about her mother-in-law that when she was coming back to be in, for Ruth, a foreign land, Ruth knew that she was not going to be able to do some of the work maybe that was necessary for her to just sustain life. And Ruth was going to be willing to do it. So she finds out that Boaz has this crop, and it's being harvested, and the harvesters are out there, and they're cutting down the wheat. And like in any harvest, there is stuff that is missed. It just isn't picked up. It isn't brought together. And so there were people that would go out and glean the fields after the harvest was done. And they'd pick up what the harvesters didn't get. And this is what Naomi then what Ruth was going to do so that her and Naomi could eat. And she went out to the fields and went to Boaz's field and was gleaning there in the field and caught Boaz's eye, and he wanted to know who she was. And now we begin a love story. Part 2 is a love story between these two people. And Ruth is working away in the fields. She has been kind of instructed by her mother-in-law where to go and what to do. And in the process of being brought to a point of getting to meet Boaz and talk to him, when Ruth goes back to her mother-in-law says, this is what you need to do. She tells her how to get in with Boaz. And Ruth does it. I'll just shorten the story to that. And the gleaning that she did was blessed by Boaz and gave her even more than what normally she would have been getting, so that her and her mother-in-law would have it. Now, Boaz was quite impressed with her. He knew that she was a foreigner. He knew that she was a widow. And he knew that she stuck with her mother-in-law through hard times. And so those characteristics were quite important here. A poor widow Ruth, the pagan foreigner, gleans in the fields of Boaz and begins to get things going. Boaz respects Ruth's character, courage, and faith, and favors her. You read Ruth 2, 10 through 12, and give you some of that information. So neat. And Ruth is falling for Boaz, and Boaz for Ruth. But because of a provision in God's law, Boaz, as a kinsman redeemer, marries Ruth to carry on the family name of Elimelech. Now this is interesting. The kinsman redeemer. What is a kinsman redeemer? Well, the idea here is if two brothers and the older one gets married and he dies, the second one has the responsibility of really marrying his wife and carrying on his brother's name. The son that comes from that union then carries on the name of the one who has died. Very important part of keeping property in the hands of the families. Let me show you this out of Deuteronomy. There's some scripture here that's really kind of interesting about it. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if the man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, "My husband's brother refuses to carry his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me." Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, "I do not want to marry her," his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, and I get this, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled." Is that weird? Wow. That's like if my brother had died and his wife Susan had come to me and said, "You need to marry me." And Jody said, "No way." Susan would come to me and take one of my shoes and spit in my face and take my shoe away. And there would be a lot of problems that would arise. So what happens here with Boaz then? What goes on? Well, when you see the story, it's really interesting because Boaz tells Ruth, says, "Ruth, there's somebody else that's in line before me to marry you." And said, "I will go to him and see if he will." And so Boaz meets with this other family member with the elders, like what we read there. And he asked him, will you take this responsibility? And he acted like he would until Boaz says, "Yeah, but you also got Ruth that you need to marry." And at that point, he chose not to. And so the sandal was taken from his foot, and Boaz was free to marry Ruth. Now, some closing observations that come through the story that are very interesting, I think. The first one is Ruth's name, along with other foreign women's name, with another foreign woman's name, Rahab, is in the genealogies of Jesus Christ out of Matthew 1, 5, and 6. And you think, what does that mean? Well, let me show you here. In Matthew chapter 1, if you ever sit down to read the New Testament through, you start with Matthew chapter 1. And I have to admit to you, it's boring. It's really pretty boring because it's so-and-so begot so-and-so, and so-and-so begot so-and-so, and so-and-so begot so-and-so. And so this is what you run into down in verses 5 and 6. Solomon, the brother or the father of Boaz, okay, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. You remember who Rahab is? Rahab was the harlot in Jericho. When the Israelites went into the land of the Philistines and in the promised land that God had, the first town they come to is Jericho, and the way that it's destroyed is because they sent some spies in, and the spies stayed at Rahab's house and were protected by Rahab, and then they snuck out from her window. Then, when the town fell, everyone that was in Rahab's home were not destroyed. Now get this again. Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So Boaz's mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. So Ruth and Boaz had Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. Wow. So it was through two foreign women, two women that were not a part of the Israelite nation, that God brought his son into this world, because you can take David then, and you can go all the way from David to Jesus. And it really shows you the importance of these two women. Their character, their faith, and their willingness to do what God wanted them to do. Wow. Let's go back to this. The second thing here is because their faith and character and willingness was what God used in them. That's what he's looking for us. That's what he wants in us. He wants us to have a faith that trusts. Faith is a really interesting thing, because faith is something you cannot see at all. You can see what comes by faith, people trusting in God. But that trusting in God comes in tough times as well as in good times. And when we develop the faith in God the way he wants us to develop it in him, it's an amazing thing that we then, wow, the capabilities that we have. And what can be done, what God can have done through us. Who would have thought it? A harlot, a prostitute, a lady of the night, a streetwalker, all those names that we think about. And it's through her that God worked. A little lady who had married a guy, and the guy died. And she decided to stay with her mother-in-law because her mother-in-law needed her and because she loved her mother-in-law. And God worked through her. Wow. What a difference it makes when we begin to understand how God works and the faith that comes from that. That faith develops character. Character causes us to do the things that we need to be doing no matter what. No matter what. Character is the most important thing. It's always, I don't get into politics from the pulpit, but it always gets to me when people talk about, well, don't bring that up. That's, character, a person's character isn't the deal here. Making decisions or whatever. What am I doing? Moving my head to the wrong spot or whatever. Making these bad decisions means nothing, but it does show character. And character, wow. Character is so important. It's through that faith and that character that people trust us. And that we're able to do things. David Nutter came to me one day when I was a youth minister, and he said, I can't get any of these guys at school to talk to me about Jesus. And I said, really? And I said, Dave, let me ask you a question. Do you ever tell dirty jokes? Yeah. Do you laugh at other guys' dirty jokes? Yeah. Do you use foul language? Yeah. See, the character he was building was not the character God wanted him to have. His faith had not been placed there right. So faith and character, and then the last one there is willingness to be used by God. That willingness. God, send me where you want. Went to church from day one. I could probably count the number of times I missed church when I was growing up on one hand. And it was always basically sickness that was causing that. I get through school, high school, and I'll go to college. I go to Bible college. Spent 4.5 years there. Some of the teachers probably had hoped I'd spend less time. But 4.5 years in Bible college. And focused all my concepts on what I could do, God, what I could do for you. Got out of Bible college, and by that time I decided what I really wanted to do was to coach basketball and reach kids in high school that would never set foot inside a church building. And so I went on to a state college to get my degree. And after about half a semester, realized that ministry really was what I wanted. So I contact one of my old college roommates who was preaching in a church in Wichita, and they were looking for a youth minister, and ended up they hired me. 1st of April, 1970. First Sunday morning I get up, I go up to the church. It's about time for Sunday school to start, and we're down in the basement, and we notice something that, oops, the baptistry was leaking. And there was water all over the basement floor. Had all those years in Sunday school and church and youth groups and camps, church camps and all that. Had all that Bible college education and knowledge and preparation. And you know what I was doing my first day in ministry? I was whipping a mop around. Because I'd said, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And I've had people since then tell me, boy, Bill, why do you get out here and do this? You've got other people. Well, because I'm not going to ask anybody to do anything I wouldn't do. The willingness to be the person God wants us to be. God never asked us to do anything but what he was willing to do it for us. When Jesus died on the cross, he paid the price to take care of everything that we deal with. And that is an amazing thing. Their faith, their character, their willingness, those are items that we need to have in our lives. A faith that I trust in God. I don't care how bad the situation is or how good the situation is, that I have the faith to trust in God. The character to always do the right thing, the God thing, to be his person. And the willingness to go where he wants me to do it. What a difference it'll make. What a lot that we can learn. The lower story is this beautiful love story between Boaz and Ruth. And Ruth and Naomi. But the upper story is the story of God and how he was helping his people to begin to understand the picture, to bringing his son into this world to take care of the needs of the world in the way that they could only be taken care of. So foreigner, faith, and female, it all applies. And Ruth was one beautiful woman. I hope and I pray that we can be a Ruth. I know that for us guys, that to be able to say I'm a Ruth is, but on the other hand, think about that a minute. That character, that faith, and that willingness is something. Pray with me, please.